Good evening. Today, we're setting off on a long-planned adventure. I've always wanted to sit down with you and have this conversation and talk about the philosophy in the classical tradition course by New Acropolis. We often advertise it, but we actually don't talk much about this topic with you. We haven't had a chance to give you a rough idea about it or where did it come from. We need to talk a bit about the discoveries that lie within. You'll see, we'll explain this a bit more. Philosophy in the classical tradition is a course divided into 7 levels. I'll tell you today about this initial level, which lasts about 5 months with 1 class per week. The introductory philosophy in the classical tradition course is a threshold, as if it were a menu of options for everything that comes in the following levels. It's such a vast amount of information that I sometimes find myself back in the moment when I took this course. There were a bunch of scattered and disorganized ideas in my head. I had a strong desire to serve, but I didn't know how or whom or in what way. And this course practically organized the ideas in my head. Today, there are several courses on organizing spaces. I could, without exaggeration, say that a good philosophy course is a course in internal environment organization. It takes all those best dreams of yours, those best intentions that were still alive and shouting inside you before society could stifle them. It gives them order. It gives you direction, the ability to realize your dreams, plan the path, and use the tools of those who came before us, who also walked this path. In other words, it amplifies, it elevates your dreams. That, for me, was truly a threshold. All these years in New Acropolis, it's been 31 years that I've been with New Acropolis. They were wonderful, but particularly these initial 5 months. It was such a large load of information that, at the same time, transformed into education and came to shape my life, that today, sometimes, it becomes a bit difficult to imagine how to think about the world without using these tools. How I used to think about the world without using these tools. They are tools that come from far away, from various thinkers. Throughout history, those who knew how to respond to life circumstances knew how to live and left that as a legacy. And it's incredible that we don't. It's incredible that we don't turn to the past to learn from those who knew how to live. This is quite a curious fact because we do turn to the past. To be able to learn new technologies, to develop from where past research left off and create something new. We do this in all fields of the exact sciences. Why not also in the field of humanities? Why not as well? What about the art of living? Deep down, I advocate for and see philosophy in this way, in the manner it was born, in the way it was developed. It's nothing more than an education on the art of living as human beings. There is a whole collection of precious things there. And what the New Acropolis Institution does is to compile these tools and place them at the forefront so that you have an idea of what there is to know, of what there is to be developed. Whether you develop with us or not, you already have certain lines of development in your own life. Of course, we want you to stay with us for the other levels. But the impact of those initial 5 months, for sure, even if you only stay for them. You don't leave there the same size as when you entered. And it's amazing because I'm telling you the truth. It's not about advertising. What I'm telling you is from what I've experienced. And what I'm sharing with you here today is a bit of what I've lived. I can't talk about all the subjects because that would be more of a promotional brochure than a lecture. I'll just give a quick overview on things that have been, let's say, a true threshold in my own life. Pieces of subjects, pieces of themes, so that you have a sense of the adventure that participating in this course constitutes. Of the adventure that is philosophy. Philosophy, it is a potential for transformation, a potential for broadening our vision of those things we've always looked at but never truly seen. It's incredible. Philosophy belongs to humanity. It's a heritage. And it's very curious that we haven't inherited it today and know so little about it. So I would like to talk with you about this. Philosophy in the classical tradition. What could this be? To start, we have a few small guidelines. I recommend that you visit our international website to get an idea of how this proposal of New Acropolis. Today, it interests us all around the world. We are in over 60 countries around the world. I brought here a screenshot of our website, which is New Acropolis USA, for you to take a look at. Anywhere in the world, before you ask me, I'll tell you, anywhere you go, the course is the same. You'll receive the same subjects. There is an international guideline, and the course is the same in all these countries, and in all the branches where New Acropolis is located. Well, our website is plenty of information. The website is quite interesting, because sometimes people write to me and say, well, this school doesn't exist near me, and sometimes it's just 2 streets away from where they live. Visit the page I've shared here with you. New Acropolis. We have many branches in US. And check out the lectures being offered free of charge and the philosophy course classes that are opening up. There has been a significant effort on our part to extend this learning, to extend the possibility of offering this knowledge to all corners of US. This effort continues. We haven't reached all the places we wanted yet, but we already have a quite extensive network of idealists who do this because they want to pass on something that was of great value to them. It was very important. I'm talking about something that is timeless and belongs to humanity. But certainly, having someone to take you by the hand and show you that philosophy is this gives you this potential for learning. To show what great men have done in history with it, to show what they have done for their personal history and for the history of humanity through philosophy. In other words, being guided at the beginning of this journey is something fundamental. But what we are offering is philosophy viewed through a lens, which is the lens of philosophy in the classical tradition. And what exactly is philosophy in the classical tradition? Of course, philosophy is the love of wisdom, as Pythagoras defined it, according to what is said, philosophos, love of wisdom, sophos or sophia. Philosophy developed there, but it's a somewhat controversial issue, because some say that Greece was the cradle of philosophy, of Western philosophy, certainly, because if you consider philosophy as the love of wisdom, it would be a bit unwise on our part to say that India did not love wisdom. And indeed, we have 6 great schools or darsanas, which were classical, traditional schools of philosophy. Or that Egypt did not love wisdom, having built the civilization it did. They expressed this seeking wisdom in a slightly different way. They were more symbolic, not having that rationalist mindset that we developed starting from Greece. But, you see, being human and seeking wisdom is almost something inevitable. It must have been born with the first human being who looked, perhaps, at the stars, who looked, perhaps, at nature in general and wanted to understand the meaning of it all. In other words, understand this equation, which is quite simple. Moving from ignorance to wisdom is an inevitable journey for the human being. Can you do it with the help of a school? You can try it alone. A school helps. Alone, you're prone to some unnecessary confusions. In the middle of the journey, it extends the path. But seeking wisdom is not something that man can forgo. It's part of your nature. It's part of the reason why we are here. It's very difficult for someone to contest a view like this. We are here seeking wisdom that befits us as human beings, the utmost wisdom we can hope to achieve as human beings. This is inexorable, a human attribute that starts to ask to be attended to at different moments in our lives. For each human being, the timing of this calling varies greatly, but it will come. If it hasn't come yet, it will at some point. Because that's what it's all about. Human life is a collection, a sequence of events that generate experiences within us, allowing us to become increasingly human. Someone who can test this, it seems quite obvious to me. It seems to me a truism from which we can proceed with considerable confidence. So, this is philosophy in the classical tradition. Why is that? Look, one thing that's important for you not to confuse. Classical is not associated with something old. Classical is associated with a very perfect way of doing something, very close to that pinnacle of perfection that we have reached so far. If you consider that, just as there is a human ideal, values, virtues, wisdom, there is also an ideal in the way of doing things, speaking humanly. There is a human way of doing things, and when we get closer to that, we create the classical, which, of course, can later be perfected by someone getting even closer to this humanism that should be embedded in all our actions. Emotions, words, thoughts, what comes closest is classical, so classical can be happening right now. It could happen next week. Classical is everything that comes closest to the most human way of doing things. And when you say, well, there is philosophy in the classical tradition, what are we talking about? We are trying to do it in the way the classics did, using them as a reference. These men, who indeed found a very well adapted, well constructed, and well elaborated way to effectively carry out their duties, to fulfill their roles, and to establish their presence in the world as human beings. So, we look to the way of philosophizing of a Plato, the universalist way of seeing the world of a Leonardo da Vinci, trying to grasp what we might call the greatest performance that humanity has achieved throughout history, as if they were our own achievements. Because deep down it is. Humanity is one, and we should know how to transfer from one point to another the best of what each of us has achieved. What prevents us from this is selfishness. And selfishness has always been a great enemy of philosophy. So, philosophy in the classical tradition means seeking wisdom in the way the classics did. They saw it, they seek, and they will seek, and taking advantage of the experience they left behind. Continuing, here I brought something quite practical, just to clarify any doubts that may arise, but in any school you look for, they will give you this information. Some I've given myself. The first level course lasts 5 months. There's one class per week, lasting 2 hours. It covers 3 subjects: ethics, sociopolitics, and philosophy of history. Our work is entirely done by volunteers. You might say, well, but you have a contribution fee. We do, because, generally, our schools operate in rented spaces. Rent isn't voluntary. Electricity, water, the phone aren't voluntary. In other words, there is a law of necessity that requires us to survive. So, we have a contribution fee to allow for our survival. However, our work is not. Our work is entirely voluntary. All the people you meet in this little school, which is just 2 streets away from your house, are volunteers. And with the same goodwill with which they receive the knowledge, they pass it on. What else do we have that's interesting? Well, ours is a philosophy. Look, see, I'm not here trying to do any kind of proselytizing and say only ours. No, anyone who is seeking wisdom must have this characteristic. I'm not here trying to create a boundary and say we have the truth, and those who are outside don't have it. That wouldn't be philosophical at all. But I want to show our intentions. If others have it, even better. If 2, if 10, if 2,000, if the entire humanity had it, all the better. We would only be delighted with that. But I'm here explaining to you the intention behind what we do. It can be yours too, even better. We are doing work that seeks to make philosophy applicable, be experienced, applied to life. In other words, that we are not just an extension, an accumulation of information, but that we are depth, that we reflect on the knowledge received, that we have the ability to elaborate on it, that we can even add new things to it. We should be able to discern when this knowledge has deviations and when it does not. That we can separate what we can learn from that which is not very appropriate. Because everything in the world is dual, and we could, in principle, learn to, from anything, if we knew how to find the light within all things. In other words, discernment, reflection, deepening, application to one's own life, a laboratory. Humanities also have a laboratory. The laboratory of humanities is the life of the human being. And philosophy is exemplary in this sense. Exemplary in this sense. The laboratory of philosophy is your life. It's our life. Bring this knowledge and test it in your own life. If you tell me about the concept of goodness, according to Plato, I'll ask you, why do you think that? Plato is the one who said it. Are you doubting Plato? I am. Call him here to explain to me why he thinks that. You can't. He's dead. And for quite some time. So that doesn't mean anything. It matters if you tell me, look, Plato said it, and I experienced it, I lived it, and tested it in practical life, and it truly yields results. Well, now it makes sense. Because it is knowledge grounded in life. It is not floating. It has a structure that supports it in the world. Did you apply it to the world? Breathed new life into it, gave it a new breath of life. In other words, as Jung would say, we breathe life into our ancestors when we learn from them. But we must have our own sip of water. In this jar, our addition, our reflection, which refines and selects. This is what makes knowledge become more profound, because more and more, the technology we ourselves create accumulates information in an incredible way. We can no longer think that we are intelligent or mysterious just because we have quantity, because no one will be able to compete with the Google of life and other things that are coming, which are even more threatening than Google, because it's an area that keeps growing. No one will be able to compete there. It's evident that if what we call being cultured or intelligent is merely a horizontal accumulation of information without any lived experience, soon we will indeed become obsolete. All of us who teach, all of us who pass on knowledge, we will become obsolete. I often use an example in the classroom that I think helps you understand this. An example, sometimes, is an image that speaks more than 1,000 words. So, imagine someone talking, a teacher discussing fear, and he's a professor, teaching about it and discussing all the theories that have been developed about this emotional phenomenon. Suddenly, a mouse enters the classroom. He's the first one to jump on the table in panic. We might ask, does this person really know about fear? What does it mean to know about fear? Memorize everything that was said. Or is it knowing how to react to it when it appears in our lives? What does it mean to know? We need to question this because our own inventions are running counter to our pretensions. To know is to be able to use knowledge to respond to life's circumstances. Notice that it's a curious thing, the historical moment we live in, because never before has so much been written. The amount of information is rising, and the number of social, economic, and human problems in general is also rising. Is there something wrong here? Because if we generate information and information solves problems as it increases, human problems should decrease. But that's not what happens. We have more books and we have more problems. Certainly, there is no communication between these two worlds. And there are 3 quotes I've brought for you which convey this beautifully. First, Socrates, the great Greek philosopher who said, "Only the knowledge that makes us better is useful." So, the idea is that you walk through the door of knowledge and come out greater than when you entered. This is formative knowledge, a knowledge that deepens. It creates roots in the earth and allows you to rise to the sky. Another quote from Jung. Deepen the roots in the earth to have the stature necessary to reach the sky. To be a bridge between two worlds, to communicate between the two worlds, to be able to learn from both worlds. This requires stature, not just extension. Another very interesting quote from the philosopher Helena Blavatsky is honor the truths with practice. I find it very interesting in a Platonic dialogue, which is the Gorgias, where Socrates, the main character, approaches the one who is conversing with him, which is Callicles, and says, "Look, Callicles, what you are about to say determines how we will live here tomorrow." It's not about a theory. If you convince me that what you say is true, tomorrow you'll find me living it out on the streets. Folks, take a moment to think about this. Who would guarantee that to someone in our days, If you convince me of your idea, tomorrow you'll find me living it, a direct relationship between what one thinks and what one lives. Honor the truths with practice. In other words, knowledge is not just something to be flaunted. It is a transformative, humanizing knowledge. Be truly honest with yourself. The fact that a person has a lot of information, holds many titles, flaunts encyclopedic knowledge, is that enough for you to trust them? Is it enough for you to know the character they have? We know that it isn't. We know that for a long time now, this is no longer enough. Those who came before us many generations ago already knew that this is not enough. In other words, there has been a disconnection between what a person thinks and what they live. Perhaps because they don't believe everything they think, or perhaps because they haven't realized that they learned in order to transform themselves and, consequently, the world they live in. Lastly, I would like to talk to you about an Indian philosopher from one of those darsanas we mentioned just a moment ago. One of the schools of philosophy in India, which was Vedanta, the great doctor of Vedanta, Shankaracharya, in a book called Viveka Socratic, a beautiful book, it says the following: a medicine does not take effect just by pronouncing its name to whoever ingests it. This phrase certainly has its humorous side. Imagine you have a terrible headache, and you keep saying acetylsalicylic acid, and don't take the pill. Obviously, that's not going to have any effect on your headache. But see if we don't do this with knowledge. We pronounce its name, but we don't ingest it, we don't bring it into our lives. How can we expect it to take effect? Then comes a historical moment. Whether you see it or not, whether you realize it or not, what's happening is that there is a growing disbelief in knowledge. Knowledge is useless, it just weighs you down, just takes up time. Well, if you belittle knowledge, which is the most human thing we have, that will, from it, generate values, generate ethical and moral behavior. If you disregard all of this, what remains? Instincts, every man for himself, selfishness, the law of survival at any cost, the law of the strongest. That's what's left, that's what's remaining. The law of the cleverest. Look around and see if that's not what's prevailing. Knowledge, implicitly, without us realizing it, has become a tool for acquiring labels, but not to gain depth, to become respected, but not reliable. In other words, it's a dissension between two worlds. Strange times we live in. So, the pursuit of philosophy, its origins, is a quest to ensure that we honor truths through practice. It's a quest to make knowledge make us better. A quest to make us ingest this medicine. Continuing. There is an interesting difference. First, as I mentioned to you, between depth and breadth, quality and quantity. And what about the knowledge we receive? There is a difference between informing and deforming, which are three very different things. To form means to impart necessary knowledge and assist the learner, to apply them in the sense of becoming a better human being. In other words, knowledge that upholds human principles. In other words, knowledge that will soon be tested in the practice of a more humane life, with values, with fraternity, with more unity, with more empathy. In other words, knowledge that transforms into humanity. And this is formative knowledge. What is informative knowledge? The one who takes a person whose character is unknown, a person about whom nothing is known. Just that they hold some titles from the past, a previous education, and you pour even more information into them. Well, just with that, you're already running a big risk, because you're amplifying things you don't know what they are. You might be empowering a psychopath, like we did with Adolf Hitler. If he had been completely ignorant, he would have been much more harmless. In other words, just informing already carries a great danger. Besides not being deep, not being transformative, it carries the risk of handing a knife to a child. And deforming, it's when you don't pass on the information, you pass. Information interpreted and decoded through personal biases by people who are not at all wise, simply intellectual fads of an era. In other words, the information comes pre-thought. It doesn't allow anyone to reach their own conclusions. I always tell my students, for example, when reading classics, when reading good books, skip the prefaces, skip any kind of preliminary judgment. Because what happens is that you shape your thinking to read according to that preface writer. Sometimes even footnotes, sometimes even the translation, make the knowledge already judged, induced, chewed up in such a way that it doesn't give the reader the freedom to think about it, interpret it, and see it for themselves. I find it extremely presumptuous for someone to take a classic book, whether it's a Platonic dialogue or Nose or the Analects of Confucius, and think that only they have the ability to understand it in such a way that it closes off interpretation, as if it were an absolute truth, doubting that your reader might have a better interpretation than theirs. Yes, you comment, you encourage, you provide elements, but you set them free. And, I say, this is a first impulse for you to reach your own conclusions. Take it inside you, chew on it, practice digesting it, assimilate it. Once again, a person doesn't live by what they consume, but by what they assimilate. In other words, transform this knowledge into life, according to your own criteria. Deformation occurs when opinion is attached to information. In other words, it already comes judged and with instructions on how you should assimilate it. It doesn't give anyone the freedom to think for themselves. I believe that any human being is capable of opening a book and forming their own opinion. Whether it's about Plato's dialogues, the Analects of Confucius, or anything else, that has already been written in humanity. If they truly desire it, if they are driven by will and strive for it, they can reach conclusions more brilliant than any preface writer. I've taught philosophy to children. New Acropolis does this. I've also taught philosophy to teenagers. New Acropolis does this. I've seen 14-year-old kids come to me with interpretations I would never have thought of. This is humanism. It's believing in the human being. So be careful. Knowledge can be shared to shape, support the growth of the human being, to instill human values. It can be given merely to inform, without knowing what will be done with it. And what conditions does that person have to do something, or it can be used to distort, to attach ideologies and ready-made thoughts to knowledge, in such a way that the one who learns assimilates everything together. In other words, intellectual fast food, everything is already processed. There's not much to do, just swallow it. Reflect on this. This is very important. Notice what kind of knowledge you have been receiving and how you have been receiving it. For philosophy, ours is an idea of formation. Knowledge underpinning the growth of humanity towards human values. Well, the three disciplines we study at the first level are ethics, sociopolitics, and the philosophy of history. In simpler terms, very simple, they work with something very practical. Ethics is about understanding within yourself what your customs are, your way of doing things. What would be the customs and ways of doing things that would harmonize you the most with yourself and the world? In other words, ethics is an internal dialogue of a person with themselves. An ethical person is someone who acts ethically even when the last door closes behind them. Even if he lived alone on an isolated island, because he acts based on who he is, not on what he will gain or avoid losing. Therefore, ethics is an internal dialogue. It is an identity of a person with their values. Sociopolitics, on the other hand, is about coexistence. We are social beings. It seems that nature made us for this. Take the hominids before the sapiens. They were already social. How can we make this almost predestination of nature for the human species become something harmonious? Because otherwise, nature is chaotic, and I don't believe it is. Philosophy, the way we approach it, does not believe that nature is chaotic. In other words, if we are social beings, there is a way to do this. In other words, learning about coexistence with others, with a family, with a large community, with a country, with humanity as a whole. This is the idea of sociopolitics. And the philosophy of history has a very interesting proposal, which is to understand the logic of history. Not just what happened, but why did it happen this way? And not another. What is the logic behind the succession of events? Where did nature want to take us? Why did we have to experience everything we did, both collectively and individually? In other words, sit Lady History down in front of you and ask, what is the logic behind all of this? Where do you want to take me with all of this? It's a very interesting reflection. And within these three disciplines, as I mentioned to you, I didn't provide a complete explanation. Brushstrokes of some themes, just to give you an idea of what's coming up, of the universe of possibilities that can be opened up out there. And let's start by talking about a topic in ethics. Ethics versus morality. Both ethikos, ethos, or moris, from Greek or Latin, are related to customs. It's curious to notice why, in our historical moment, ethics has become so intellectualized. In other words, ethics is a book that deals with professional ethics of a certain profession or a specific institution, whereas morality is what we practice on the street in our daily lives. In other words, a citizen can be moral, amoral, or immoral, which are different things. I want to address that here. We judge this by their behavior. Notice that it seems there has been a distancing between the intellectual and the everyday. That these two words, at certain moments in history, were one and the same, and now they are two. Because somehow, if you stop to interpret, our civilization conceives that a man, intellectually, is one way, and, in practice, in daily life, is absolutely different. In other words, an internal division that will logically lead to an external division. As our dear Carlos Drummond de Andrade used to say, we live in a time of divided parties. A time of divided men. Temporal and timeless ethics is also something we learn as soon as we enter the discipline of ethics, which is a super interesting perception. When we start studying through the sciences that the universe has laws, that nature has laws, it's a bit odd that we don't come to the conclusion that we are also part of nature, and that there are also general laws that apply to everything and specific ones that apply to human nature. Just as there are specific laws that apply to plants, minerals, and planets, there are laws, there is a timeless ethics, as if there were what the Indians call Dharma, the arm of God extended over the cosmos. A path of revolution that leads all beings to the ideal. And this universal law, at historical moments, in each historical moment, undergoes an adaptation. It takes on the guise of a particular civilization at a space-time crossroads. So we can say that human values, like justice, fraternity, kindness, and love, are timeless ethics. The application of this, for example, within technology, on a social network, would be to be fair, treat everyone with dignity, know how to be kind, know how to be honest, and all the others. Attributes of good coexistence. This is an application that exists in this historical moment. The application of justice in ancient Greece was different, but it is the same justice, applied to different contexts, space, and time. What happens is that at a certain moment, many times. In history, there have been times, it's not exclusive to us, there is a disconnection, which means that a principle adopted as just and good in a specific civilization is not universal. What is just there? If you extended that, it would go against the grain, like timeless justice. Is it just to exploit? Is it just to mutilate? Is it just to use others for personal gain? Is it just to be cruel? In many contexts, this existed within a legal code. And look, if we try to notice, we see that this also exists in many current codes of behavior, both the written ones and those implicit, those new Acropolis USA shaped by customs. We still have this discord in various aspects. Where there are setbacks, it means that a civilization is not cultivating humanity. It is making human beings more uncultured. Culture is also another name that is very interesting. Classically, it was thought that all human beings have within them a seed, a deep seed of human values, a seed of humanity. And culture, which shares the same etymological root as cultivate, would be to tend to the soil where this seed is planted, in such a way that it had all the facilities to come to Iona. When we realize that some cultures are built as if they were placing a layer of cement over the seed of human values, to prevent it from rising, and with a bunch of attractions that pull it further down, we could say that we have a counterculture. In other words, civilization is not fulfilling its purpose. Timeless ethics stands back to back with temporal ethics. And when we have this, we have a friction with nature, and surely we will be the losing side. Certainly, this will generate unhappiness, generate separateness, and perhaps even destruction for the one who attempts it. Because nature is relentless, we can destroy part of it, but not it as a whole. Iona going against the grain of nature is a form of suicide, and not just for us, but for humanity, for the human family to which we belong. So, temporal and timeless ethics give us a very interesting perception of where we are aligned and where we have lost our way. What still fulfilled its original purpose? Because today it is the most modern and desirable thing in the world. The man withdraws from civilization and goes to an isolated place, when civilization should be the place where he would be most protected. Protected from the harshness of nature, from wild beasts, and there comes a certain moment when man, as it is classically said, becomes a wolf to his own kind and he prefers to isolate himself. This is the best way to live today, to isolate and go to a secluded place where he feels more protected. Civilization, which was once liberating, is now enslaving, and everyone wants to distance themselves from it. That is curious. Cities were meant to be the best place in the world for human beings, just like the pack is the best place in the world for wolves. A lone wolf doesn't stand much of a chance. Notice there are a lot of interesting relationships and consequences here, to be considered in relation to this aspect of temporal and timeless ethics. These are just brushstrokes. As I mentioned to you, in sociopolitics, we have something that is very striking, which is the Platonic cave myth. But within our new Acropolis channel and on YouTube, we have a lecture exclusively about this. So I won't delve into that, including because we are just giving brushstrokes here. But I would like to draw your attention to one aspect of the cave myth, which is the fact that the man who leaves the cave sees things illuminated by the sunlight. What a wonderful thing! Isn't it logical that he leaves the cave and sees things illuminated by the sunlight? This is a myth, and in the myth, nothing is in vain. According to Plato, the sunlight represents the idea of the good. The man who looks at things illuminated by the idea of the good is the man who sees reality. He emerged from slavery, from the shadows of the cave. Just take a moment to think about that. What does it mean to see things illuminated by the idea of the good? How do we look at things? I always use a quote from Leo Tolstoy, which is very interesting, that says to those who pass through a forest and only see firewood for their fire, when you look at something, what is the thought we have today? Implicit. What use is this to me? Why does this interest me? When we look at a person, it's the same. Immanuel Kant used to say that the most moral thing in the world is to take the rational being as a means, not as an end in itself. We take everything as a means. In other words, what use is this to me? Using others, not just human beings, but nature as a whole, as means. The end in itself is always your personal gain. In other words, we look at things illuminated by a very dim flashlight. The shine from a light, from a very small focus, which is the light of our interests. That only illuminates the part of things that can bring you some benefit. In other words, if something doesn't bring you any benefit, you don't see it. It is a blind spot for you. Now, imagine that you have a personal problem and need to open up to a friend. You will look for a person you trust and who wants nothing but your well-being. accept your well-being? Or will you look for someone who might use your information for their own benefit? That's almost a ridiculous question. Of course, we want a person without desires, without interests, who only wants our well-being. It's a mistake. We think that nature is naive and doesn't notice either. It doesn't open up to someone who wants to manipulate it. It opens up to the one who has no selfish desires and wants nothing but its well-being. And this man, he is the wise one who does not have this desire, this eagerness to use the universe for his own ends. He doesn't feel like the center of the universe. He feels like a servant of the axis of the universe, which is the law. He looks at things thinking, not how this serves me, but how can I serve this? And treated in this way, nature opens up and shows its heart. And the one who knows the heart of all things is a wise person. But why does he know? Because he desires nothing other than to serve. He doesn't manipulate things for selfish interests. And so, things open up and reveal their heart. The man who sees things illuminated by the light of the sun, wanting only the good of the things themselves and not what they can do for him. This one sees the heart of all things, and the one who sees the heart of all things is a wise person. Reflect a little on this symbolism. This is not an invention. This is Plato himself, who says that the light of the sun is the idea of the good. Reflect on the multiple meanings that lie behind this. Still within the realm of sociopolitics, a bit further on, in the comments we make on Plato's dialogue, the Republic, which is one of the most important of the Platonic dialogues, we will have nothing less than the concept of the good, the beautiful, and the just, which is a triad of fundamental values for Plato, developed here in the Republic. And, of course, we will delve deeply into this within the course. As I mentioned at the beginning, here we have brushstrokes, but he presents very surprising ideas. The idea, for example, that the good is what unites. Imagine, it's as if we are climbing towards the peak of a pyramid. As we ascend, we are closer, not only to that peak, but also more united among ourselves. If you find yourself increasingly disconnected from people, less and less able to do something for them, with diminishing empathy, this geometrically means you are descending the pyramid, not ascending. The effect of good things is to harmonize. The universe is to recompose. Unity in multiplicity is to lead all things towards unity. All those who ascend draw closer not only to the peak, but also to each other. And then he develops a long reasoning around this. The good is what unites, and since the world is made up of pieces, it is multiple. All things, in order to remain united in the world, must pay tribute to the good. If they were entirely evil, they would explode. So, anything in the manifested world has some good within it. And we could try to seek the good in all things and bring them to Iona. And when we manage to bring to Iona the good and positive aspect of all things, we leave a luminous trail wherever we go. Because, by definition, if it were absolutely evil, the repulsive force of its parts would be so great that it would explode. And the good is what gives cohesion, what binds together that which unites. So, every time we take our journey, we interact with all the beings around us. We must account for it in there. There is something good. Imagine that you studied German back in high school. Study for a year, knows almost nothing, doesn't remember much anymore. And today, in middle age, you encounter someone on the street, a lost tourist who only speaks German. You are forced to dig deep into your memory and pull out that little bit you remember, to be able to give some guidance to this person, to help them find, I don't know, the hotel, the airport, whatever they need. To communicate with her, you have to bring to Iona that little bit of German that was within you. Let's go here. Silly example. What does she mean by that? Look, imagine you that a person has a little bit of good within them and their consciousness is polarized. In this idea of good, the human good, that which elevates us to the condition of humanity, full. If you are polarized in this, when making contact with this person so that they can communicate with you, They will have to bring to Iona this good that exists within them, perhaps forgotten in a little corner. To interact with you, she will have to bring that to Iona. Maybe that was the only opportunity in her life. Perhaps she becomes aware now that this exists. That's why, wherever you go, you leave a luminous trail. In other words, everyone who interacts with goodness has to bring to Iona the goodness that exists within themselves. And then we start drawing a lot of conclusions about it. The philosophy course is a wonderful journey. You can think, for example, about things that exist, Iona, and question the Platonic principle. Philosophy is for that, for you to think, for you to question. If I ask you, for example, about corruption, it is an evil thing, no one doubts that. It's a horrible thing, but Plato said that to exist it must have some good in it. What is the good in corruption? I'll stay. Well, then you look for 1,000 oddities of when it might be good. No, in human behavior, it is never good. It happens that you buy a biodegradable detergent. Why? Because it decomposes faster, it corrupts more quickly. In other words, the corruption in the detergent makes it not polluting. Who told you to place it in human behavior? Everything in its place, which is the concept of justice that comes soon. There is no evil in the world. In other words, corruption is good. For example, bags are now increasingly being made to avoid using plastic, but they are made of elements that decompose quickly. In other words, in this field, corruption is useful. Who placed it in human behavior? Laziness. Does anyone doubt that laziness is bad? Today, there are even people who doubt it, but I think the sensible ones still don't. Laziness is terrible in human behavior. Now, laziness is a law of nature, and it is inertia. If someone tries to break down the door of your house and it doesn't give way because it's very strong, very inert, it is a virtuous door, meaning it is a virtue in doors and a vice in humans. Who placed it in human behavior? In other words, you begin to perceive the meaning of things. You start to understand that there is a great puzzle, and the just, Plato's justice, is precisely the one who finds the place where all things justify themselves, where all things reveal their luminous side. The just person is the one who assembles the puzzle of the universe. Give the right place to all things, everything in its place. There is no evil in the universe. Remember Horus, the son of Osiris, who avenges his father's death by defeating his uncle Set in battle. Does he kill Set? No. The breath that Set had, the anger that Set had, served to give him a powerful breath. And his breath began to blow and generate wind in the boats. In the sails of the gods, the boat of the gods began to travel more swiftly through eternity with the powerful breath of Set. He had something that could be luminous. He had some aspect through which he justified himself. Because within a fairly simple logic, if we believe, for example, in the idea of God, in the philosophical idea of God as one, as absolute, if there is something outside of God, then he is no longer absolute. He becomes relative. There is him and this thing, both of them relative. So, if there were a molecule in the universe that was absolutely evil, it would negate God. So, to find the place where all things justify themselves. This is the philosophical conception, the vision of the cosmos, the vision of God. Finding the right place where all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. And we return to find unity in multiplicity. When you look at Plato's concept of beauty, which is the root of the great aesthetic concepts in history, beauty is like that which elevates, which leads man towards human goodness. By your works I will know you, that which elevates the consciousness of man, that which humanizes him. In other words, you can't judge beauty by opinions. Just as you don't judge a medicine by opinions, you judge it by the effect it has when a sick person takes it. Things justify themselves by the contribution they make to the world. Nothing justifies itself in isolation. So, beauty would be that which has the capacity to elevate human consciousness towards goodness, towards human goodness, towards the human ideal of values, virtues, and wisdom. And from there, the universe of considerations that can be woven about this as well. It's just the starting point. This leads to wonderful, long discussions in the classroom, 1,000 consequences over time. You have no idea what a class on this is like. They are touching, they are transformative, they are beautiful. Continuing, in the philosophy of history, there's a lot of what I mentioned to you, of the logic of history as a fundamental element. Remember, the philosophy of history, as a whole, teaches us to redeem the arbitrariness of historical events, to realize that the historical trajectory of civilizations, the historical trajectory of men, your own historical trajectory, has a logic. You didn't pass through places randomly. You went through the places you needed to go to grow. This would be the logic of history. And then you will notice that several civilizations of the past, some great civilizations of the past, like Rome itself, who worked with pragmatic history, didn't see history as a science, but as philosophy. And they considered that by observing the course of history, they understood more about their own needs, about the rough edges they needed to smooth out, about the very elements in which they needed to grow. So they believed that history was cosmos and not chaos. That history followed a great law, which is the law of necessity that leads everyone to become what they were meant to be. It leads all beings to completeness as such. It leads men to be men. So they realized this. There is a very interesting Greek drama, which is the Orestia, where Orestes, a priest of Artemis, even when severely punished, never turns against the goddess. He says, "The goddess deemed this necessary for me." There is a very interesting mythologist, Walter Friedrich Otto. He conducts a study of Greek heroes and demonstrates this. Even in the midst of the greatest adversities, they did not doubt. The gods, whoever they may be, believed that I needed this to grow. They didn't say, "The gods abandoned me. The gods were unjust. No gods were against me." They trusted in the logic of history. Recently, I was reading a book by a wonderful writer who was Simar, the great mythologist, especially of India. He spoke about this characteristic of life that myths reflect. It goes from catastrophe to catastrophe. A catastrophe, a stabilization, and growth of consciousness. Man becomes stagnant, a new catastrophe that pushes him upward again. In other words, consciousness evolves through catastrophic events where it is pushed forward. Otherwise, our tendency, our inertia, keeps us stuck on the path. So, you will notice that these civilizations believe that life has a logic. And it leads us to its heart. It leads us to the understanding of the meaning of life itself. From the stones, the plants, the animals, the humans, the planets, the universe as a whole. It leads us to its own meaning, its own secret, its own mystery. And another interesting thing we see within philosophy, within history, and this is very beautiful, is that, closely tied to this story of the logic of history as philosophy, a separation was born between history and myth. History narrates chronological events as closely as possible to what really happened, while mythology narrates them symbolically. History tells how it happened, mythology tells why. So, if I tell you that one day, in a certain place at 12 o'clock, it started to rain, and by 3 p.m., the rivers were overflowing, and by 6 p.m., there was a flood. That's a historical narrative, but I can tell you, in such a civilization, a flood occurred. The flood within itself carries symbolism, meaning that something wrong was there, which was washed away through this catastrophe. Was purified, that civilization was reoriented by pain. It might not have been rain. It might not have been a flood. There could have been 1,000 historical facts. They are expressed by a single symbolic fact, which tells the why and not the how. There was a need there. That way of living needed to be destroyed and cleansed by history. That civilization needed to be renewed. This is the myth of the flood. So, on their paths, in parallel, they don't clash, nor is one superior to the other. History is the what? And myth the why? And if we know how to work with both, we have the body and soul of history, both the collective and our individual. We redeem our lives from arbitrariness. We give it meaning. As a great anthropologist, Mircea Eliade, once said, "The sacred is the function of giving meaning." By understanding life, we redeem our lives from banality, we fractalize time. In ethics, returning to it, we will see one of the most interesting things. There are different ways to see this. But at the beginning of ethics, we work with the Indian perspective, the constitution of man, the septenary constitution. I often say that it's one of the teachings that served as a threshold for me at this first level. How impressive it is to hear so many contradictory voices within us, and you don't know what it's about. One voice is against something, another voice is in favor, one voice criticizes, another voice praises, and you don't know who you are amidst all this. You lack discernment, you lack intelligence, intelliger, to choose among the things that are not what they seem. Because you don't name the voices, you don't know who the voices inside you are. And when we work, whether with the Indian perspective of the septenary constitution or with the Greek vision of the caduceus of Mercury, the three worlds, we are naming the voices. So you realize that these voices have a certain identity, and you begin to learn how to deal with them. So the second Indian classification, which is the septenary constitution that we study here, notice this detail: the way we study philosophy at New Acropolis works with universal philosophy. We believe that all those who seeking wisdom were philosophers. So we study Confucius. For us, they were philosophers. We study the Indian schools, which for us and many others were philosophical schools. We learn from anyone who has something to teach. If you say, "I love wisdom, but I won't seek it in Egypt because they were animal worshippers there," well, you've already lost your status as seeking wisdom. Whoever loves wisdom will seek it beyond time, beyond space. Wherever there is a trace, you go after it. So, learn from all those who have something to teach. So, India viewed the human being as composed of 7 elements, hence the septenary constitution. The basic, which was a little square, is the union of 4 elements. In fact, the square associated with the square of the world, as the Romans say, the square is associated with the box, linked to that box, that, when you take it apart, it forms a cross. Associated with various elements connected to the earth to the base of the pyramid. The square is very common. The 4 elements, earth, water, air, and fire, are associated with matter, the material world. So, this material part of man, according to the Indians, was composed of a physical body, of the energy that circulates in this physical body, of emotions and the mind, practice, the one that governs our daily lives. And these 4, each has their own interests. If there isn't an administrator above them, harmonizing everything there, like a building manager of an apartment, it's chaos. I use the example of the lazy and love-struck boy. The body wants to stay in bed, and the emotions want to chase after the girlfriend. This is an inner war, it's chaos. When you start to understand these voices and realize that you are more than them, they are your vehicle, you begin to harmonize them. So, you know that the voice of the body always wants to remain in inertia. That's its happiness. You know that the voice of energies always wants to receive more energy. Then comes the ambitious one, the greedy one. The voice of emotions craves pure adrenaline, wants to live experiencing strong emotions. The voice of the lower mind, the concrete mind. It's the curious voice that wants to know how things are, but doesn't commit to anything. It wants to snoop around every corner of the world, but doesn't want to commit to anything. It's the great curious one. So, you know these 4 voices, you recognize when an argument arises within you, which one it belongs to. And at the same time, you begin to realize that you have a consciousness that is above the 4. It's like thinking that these 4 voices are your vehicle, and your vehicle is parked outside at the door. You are the driver. You begin to have a disidentification that allows you to find the driver. And for the Indians, it's this triad. The triad, the triangle, the cornucopia of the Celts, which is the cone, the pyramids, the 3, the religious trinities, the philosophical trinities of values in Plato, in Plotinus. The number 3 is always associated with the sacred number. There are 3 elements, which I won't go into detail about here, that constitute the essence of the human being. When a human being reaches a level of elevated consciousness that allows them to perceive their essence, they can look at their vehicle from the outside and then command it. Because if he identifies with his vehicles, he will be a puppet in their hands. Then he will always be chasing the interests of one and the other, back and forth, an eternal dissatisfied soul. A man can only master what he disidentifies from. Hence the reference to Greek theater, which called the character we play in the world, the stage character, the persona, that mask. You know that in Greek theater, sometimes, few actors played multiple characters by changing masks. So, for them, what we use in the world is a persona, it's a mask. But behind the scenes, the actor has nothing to do with it. Learns through this, but he is not that. So, this quaternary of the Hindus would be our mask, our persona, and we, in essence, are the actor behind the scenes. If we are not aware of who we are, we become promiscuous with the mask. We start to think that we are it, and like bad actors who get too involved with their character and become slaves to it. A good actor always knows who he is and who the mask is, and he guides the mask. So, a series of elements that you can discuss from the moment you start calling things by their names. To those voices that exist within you, to know a bit about the structure of what ancient civilizations claim to be the human being. Get to know and test it in practice. See how this happens. See if this works. See if this provides answers to your internal conflicts. There are no absolute truths. There are indeed elements for reflection and testing. Another very interesting thing we learn in ethics. We see the foundation of the metaphysics of morals by Immanuel Kant. It's good. He's a complex author. It's a complex work, but the idea is to make what is complex, simple, and applicable. As Leonardo da Vinci is often quoted, simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. So, there's an element of Kant that I find very beautiful, which are the so-called imperatives of human action. The hypothetical imperative and the categorical imperative. What is the hypothetical imperative? It's the one that starts with the conditional if. If I do such a thing, I gain something else. If I don't do it, I lose something else. In other words, you do or don't do things out of desire or fear. What interests you is the outcome, not the thing itself. And the categorical imperative, what you do for the sake of the thing itself, you do out of duty. I love. Why? Because I'll gain or lose. No, I love because I'm human and it's natural for humans to love. And so I am just. Why? Will I gain advantages from this? No, I am just because I am human. I fulfill myself by being what nature expects of me. I am motivated by human nature, by the simple act of being, and not by what I will gain or lose afterward. Things stop being pawns for selfish interests. Greater. Man stops being a pawn in the hands of fear and desire, as we say, like a lab mouse. It's either an electric shock or a little piece of cheese. He doesn't have his own motivations. He doesn't act for what he is. Acts based on what he will gain or lose from it. In other words, these two hypotheses envision a significant transition in human behavior. It's an intrinsic interest. Notice that everything that is nobler in human life is valuable in itself, and not for what you will gain or avoid losing from it, as we mentioned, love. I love because this person earns a lot of money. This is a private income fund. Isn't it love? I am just because this person can reward me. That's personal marketing. That's not justice. Love and justice are valuable in themselves. Everything that is noblest in man is valuable in itself. Very interesting. You must have heard that some thinkers referred to Spinoza's God. Einstein said he believed in Spinoza's God. I don't believe in Spinoza's God. I believe in the God of Rabia al-Adawiya, the master of wisdom. This peculiar Sufi master, she had a prayer that I always repeat in my lectures, where she said the following: My Lord, God, if I seek you out of desire for your heaven, cast me out of your heaven. If I seek you out of fear of your hell, burn me in your hell. But if I seek you only for what you are, receive me into the bosom of your glory. You realize that to be angry, to be audacious is pure, imperative, categorical. And it seems that when we start comparing, many voices speak of the same thing. Certainly, and I think this has a lot to do with philosophical thought in general. But I speak only for myself. I believe in God, Rabia al-Adawiya, that we seek for its own sake, not for what we can gain or avoid losing, neither out of fear nor desire. We shouldn't do this to lab mice, nor to humans. In sociopolitics, returning to the topic, one of the most beautiful things, truly beautiful, is when you learn about the school of Stoic philosophy, which begins in Greece, but develops in Rome. It was a very practical school, a school for times of crisis. That's why I think it is very suitable for the present times. For Stoicism, it is not an essentially different philosophy from the other great schools of philosophy. It has its peculiarities, but overall it is not contradictory, but it is adapted for times of crisis. It has some beautiful peculiarities. It strongly emphasizes the aspect of morality, the constant effort of man to master his animal self, as if it were a centaur, where the human part subdues the animal part, and not the other way around, like the minotaur, where the animal subdues the human. In other words, a strict moral code where they always ensured that the best part of themselves was in charge of their lives. Their human self was in command of life. Teaching by example, which today is an overused phrase, a cliché, but for them it was explicit. Strict, extremely necessary. In other words, people learn much more from who you are than from what you say. Your entire life is a lesson for an attentive observer. And if you have contradictions, those contradictions will be cracks that cause doubt in the one receiving what you intend to convey. We don't need to be perfect, but to convey something, we must be committed to it. We don't need to have perfection, but a spirit of improvement. We fall 1,000 times, but let us rise and continue to fight, because people expect it from us. It's not about perfection, but a constant spirit of improvement. So, this idea of teaching through example was fundamental for them. They also worked a lot with the concept of eudaimonia, which was the daimon, the divine within us. They said that a person who has this brilliant essence, this strengthened identity, is affected by very few things from the outside. That's why they said it was impossible to affect a Stoic. They said there are two categories of things: those that depend on us and those that do not depend on us. What does not depend on us? Whether it rains or it's hot, whether people treat you well or poorly, whether the world is just or unjust today, whether you have health or not, and a bunch of things that can affect you that come from outside that don't depend on you. These things shouldn't be a reason, neither for you to become sad, nor for you to become overly joyful. Now, what depends on you? The response you give to all these things. If the world was unjust and you remained upright, that depended on you, and that's a reason for joy. If it rained and you didn't curse nature, that made you a balanced person. That depended on you, and that's worthy of joy. If you fell ill, but still didn't lose your dignity, that depended on you, and that's worthy of joy. So he would say, a man should only rejoice or be saddened by that which depends on him. And if in what depends on him he does not fail. Serenity is assured, which is the happiness inherent to humans. Peace of mind, which is the happiness inherent to the human being, the center, the balance. And many other interesting things, like, for example, conduct in relation to the facts of life, what we call the theory of responsibility. Nothing happens to a man that is not inherent to being human. In other words, no one is to blame for what happens to you. You came into the world with a need for experience, and this need for experience attracts the factors that will provide it. If you need to develop patience, annoying people will come your way, not because they want to provoke you, but because you called them. Your need for experience brought them into your life. If it weren't them, it would be others. But you needed to go through that. Beings are not to blame for your troubles. They are unconscious agents of the experience you needed to live. Just as you are an unconscious agent of the experience they needed to live. And they attract each other for the affinity of experiences they need to go through. In other words, the theory of responsibility is about taking the reins of your own life, and to say, everything that happens to me happens because I needed to go through it. If I didn't need it, no force would be able to make me go through a point where I don't need to be. So, Nothing happens to a man that is not inherent to being human. The extinction of blame marks the beginning of moral progress, says Epictetus. That's very beautiful. Another idea that we call the ideal of the mango fruit. Evidently, we talk about this today. Not at that time. They say there are two possibilities: that a man can be gentle, soft on the inside, weak on the inside, and tough on the outside, or the opposite, that he is tough on the inside and gentle on the outside. And the man of integrity fully embraces the second possibility, which we call the mango fruit, because of this. When he needs to be demanding, when he needs to be disciplined, when he needs to be tough, it's with himself, because no one else can do it. He doesn't allow weaknesses, he doesn't permit deviations of character in himself. Now, with others, be gentle. Consider all possibilities. Consider what can make this person better, even if you have to make a severe judgment. Because they need it. Don't do it with hatred, do it with compassion. He says that, in general, weak men do the opposite. They're like the coconut, tough with others and gentle with themselves. And, in the face of pain, they crumble. Those who are so tough, perhaps you have already met them, and history is full of such cases. Tough, relentless with others. When they confront pain, they cry like children. In other words, duality must be exercised in some way, and you can choose how you will exercise it. Tough on oneself, because no one else can do it. With others, empathy, compassion, justice, but without hatred, considering all the needs and possibilities of a human being. This was also a very interesting thing, after all, a series of elements that came together to form a philosophy that grants dignity. It gives an extraordinary sense of honor. And that we would need it today, perhaps much more than in the decline of Greece and Rome. Because we are living in a decline from a human perspective. Things ascend, but men descend. As Professor Jorge Angelo Evraga, the founder of New Acropolis, used to say, the man who drove the chariot and the man who pilots the jet have seen the machine evolve, but not necessarily the man himself. So we are living through a crisis of human values, which is not unique in history. I hope, I have faith we will find a way out, just as we have every time. I am neither pessimist nor optimist. I am a realist. Philosophy seeks this. Shall we go out? Yes, if we work now. And how should we work? To cultivate these human values within ourselves, and to set a reference point for the rest of humanity. Is this way. And, in addition, within the philosophy course, just to give you an idea of the number of debates this generates in the classroom, the enlightenment it provides. We discuss Aristotle, and within Aristotle, particularly in the Nicomachean Ethics, the concept of happiness, what human happiness is. We discuss with Confucius in his Analects the entire structure of the ceremonial aspects of life, the protocols of life, in which he was so strict. The Bhagavad Gita, this beautiful dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna, is nothing more than the discourse between our essence and our personality. The maxims of Egypt, the maxims of viziers like Tahotep, the wisdom of Egypt for life, the Dhammapada, the principles of Buddhist philosophy, so many, many, many other things, all in just 5 months. You have no idea. It's an atomic bomb. It's almost like a neutron bomb. You stand physically upright, but inside everything is revolutionized. A new way of seeing the world. It's a completely new prism, like you've received a big, beautiful toolbox to continue your journey in life, but now very well equipped. That is philosophy. Imagine the amount, because our classes are dialogues, the number of observations and insights that emerge and are built around these classic themes. Universal, so important now, as they were at the time they were introduced, or perhaps even more important now. Truly, our classes are what we might call a kind of celebration. A celebration. A celebration of something within us that is rarely invited to our mundane daily celebrations. A celebration of our essence, our soul, our consciousness. It's very fulfilling to work with this. It's very fulfilling to share this. I can't simulate this for you. You have to live it and see for yourselves. Well, what we are, I think you've already gotten a sense of it. Us. Philosophy of New Acropolis. The way we practice philosophy, we don't devalue anyone's approach. We are not here to compete, nor to confront. We are here to compose. That is our goal. This is our way, which should fit with what each person does and should allow for harmony. This is our identity. That's what I've been working towards for 31 years. We are volunteers, with a love for wisdom and a spirit of improvement. And we work for ourselves and for others. Because we believe that ideas change the world. Loyalty to ideas, human principles, humanism changes the world. And we live for this. We are committed to these ideas. We don't just think they are beautiful. What do we offer? At New Acropolis, we help individuals inherit all this wealth of wisdom that exists out there. Of inheritance, there is a will designating this for you, and perhaps you might leave this world without receiving it. If someone doesn't shake you and say, "Hey, this is yours, open it, see what's inside." That's more or less what we set out to do, to be deliverers of inheritances, precious inheritances. Maybe you don't know, but there are people who go around researching their previous generations, making family trees, hoping to find some noble relative. Look, you have a lot of noble things in your past. Perhaps not in a blood relationship, but in a kinship of consciousness. Surely you have a precious inheritance waiting for you. And philosophy strives to gather all of this and deliver it to you. We help you inherit the knowledge of all those who knew how to respond to life humanely. All those who knew how to respond to circumstances as human beings who left a human legacy along the way. I always tell a story that I find very interesting. It was historical, but it also has its symbolic aspect. Why not? When those 300 Spartans were called to go to Thermopylae, the gates of fire, to hold off the Persians for 3 days, don't think that Leonidas, the Spartan king, believed that with 300 men he would defeat the Persians. He hoped that Athens and the city-states as a whole would finish their religious festivities so they could go to war. He had to hold the Persians at those gates of fire for 3 days. He really managed to do it. It is said that in Sparta, when King Leonidas made the list of 300 warriors who would go with him to the battlefield, of this heroic initiative to save Greece, it is said that the men were very curious to know what criteria he used to make this selection. And all those who were on that list did not consider themselves disadvantaged. They considered themselves honored to be there and to be able to hold back the advance of the Persians. When I see that we are living in a historical moment of great selfishness, where selfishness threatens to undermine the very foundations of human relationships, where selfishness threatens to isolate man from himself and from humanity, it threatens to undermine our most essential values. Imagine that the conscious and awakened man who is in the world at this historical moment may have been selected by the list of a great Leonidas, who considered that we could be there in those 3 days. We don't know the duration of these 3 days, what kind of days they are, but we are holding back the dissolution. Selfishness, hatred, prejudices, we are holding them back so that humanity has time to prepare. In other words, everything that is awake and conscious in this moment of such dehumanization, as there is now, as there have been others in history, perhaps we are on the list of a great Leonidas, and instead of feeling disadvantaged by this, we should feel honored. If we are conscious and we are here, it's because someone believed we could do something. Try to see it from this mythical perspective. It adds a great beauty to our lives. And it makes us feel more prepared to do what, in any case, we should be doing, to follow our path towards the fullness of the human condition. In any case, we would have to do it. If myths help us, long live the myths. What we are not, what New Acropolis is not. We have no connection, we are neither linked to religious movements nor political movements. We do not consider ourselves owners of the truth, of any truth, really. We encourage people to walk, to develop discernment and grow on their own. We don't tow anyone along. We do not consider ourselves better than anyone else. and we do not suffer from a terrible disease. That today permeates the world, movements in general, which is what Carl Jung called the inflation of the ego, of considering ourselves to be far above what we truly are. From this ailment we will not perish. We know who we are. We are seekers of truth, full of dreams and full of enthusiasm for self-improvement. No perfection. Nothing about knowing something that others don't know. The little we know, we are eternally sharing, eternally passing it forward. We are apprentices of philosophers, a bit like Mickey Sorcerer's apprentice. Sometimes a little clumsy, but always striving for improvement from our mistakes and always generously sharing everything we manage to achieve. This is a school of philosophy, and this is New Acropolis. Our greatest adversary, selfishness. What the Tibetan tradition called the heresy of separateness. Selfishness that divides us internally and externally. Selfishness that prevents us from being ethical, aesthetic, kind, empathetic. Selfishness that hides from us our best human abilities. Selfishness that isolates people. The same selfishness that causes a cell to turn against the body and kill it. The cancerous selfishness. Our greatest enemy, our only enemy, is selfishness. And our main vocation, as apprentices of philosophers, philosophy in the classical tradition, our main vocation is to humanize. That's who we are. I wanted to convey to you what I felt when I first encountered it. New Acropolis. She was a girl, a young idealist, yes, wanting to do something for humanity. Yes, but a bit like that saying, hearing the rooster crow but not knowing where it's coming from. Not really knowing what to do, nor with what tools. And it was this state of mind that brought me to New Acropolis, this mindset of someone who is seeking philosophy. I wanted to share with you, because I'm sure that perhaps some of you are out there, full of needs, and they don't realize that perhaps all these needs are just a call from the soul, just a need for philosophy. It is a human attribute. It doesn't belong to an institution. It belongs to humanity. So I find a bit of that moment of my search for philosophy, of encountering philosophy, in two things, in a little story and in a poem. I would like to share both with you, if you allow me. First, it's a Zen tale, one that I often tell, so it's quite well known, which says there was a young man who intended to become a disciple of a master. And he rehearses, because he knows the master will ask why he wants to be a disciple. He rehearses his answer 1,000 times in front of the mirror until he finds one he thinks is satisfactory. When he stands before the master is meditating and he interrupts him. The master asks, "Yes, my young one, what do you want?" He says, "I want to be your disciple, master." The master thinks for a moment and asks, "But why do you want to be my disciple?" He already knew this question was coming. He composes himself and gives that rehearsed answer, "Yes, master, I want to be your disciple because I feel a desperate thirst for God." Then the master stops, thinks for a moment, slowly stands up, and invites the young man to walk with him. The young man thinks, well, this must be a good sign. They approach a river, both kneel down, and when the boy least expects it, the master plunges his head into the water and holds it there. And he starts to struggle, he kicks, the master holds on, desperate. When the master lets go, he says, "What is this, master? Do you want to kill me? I was suffocating." The master says, "Stop for a moment and tell me, when you were down there, what did you feel a desperate need for?" Air, of course. Exactly. When you feel a desperate need for God, like you felt for air down there, you can come to me and I will accept you. So understand, when philosophy speaks of God, it is not a theological figure. It's about a sense of life, of a harmonious whole in which my life fits, in a greater sense that justifies all things. A dharma, a dharman, in other words, the idea of God for the philosopher is the reason why he gets out of bed every day. On one occasion, I was saying that I live in Brasilia and I love this city because when I look around, Brasilia, It's a very characteristic city because it doesn't have mountains, so you see an immense sky, you have immense horizons. This gives you air. It gives you a feeling of freedom, which some places don't give me the same thing. It gives a bit of claustrophobia. I keep imagining the absence of a symptom, of a sense of life, the lack of a conception of being within a harmonious universe with laws. What name would you give to this? It completely takes your breath away. Freedom, it even removes the excuses for getting out of bed in the morning. I'm not trying to convert anyone to theological views here, but I just want you to know, maybe you feel this need for meaning, and you can call it whatever you like. Well, we call it God, but God doesn't fit within any name. Simply this harmony that justifies all things and gives meaning to everything. This reason to get out of bed in the morning. We feel that we are part of a whole, where our existence has meaning, where our existence makes a difference. Secondly, as I mentioned to you, a poem. This year, recently, in May, marked 100 years since the death of a Mexican poet whom I greatly admire. I am also an aspiring poet. I have my own poems, and I particularly admire this Mexican poet named Amado Nervo. This year marks 100 years since his passing, and he has a book where he writes this poem, The Shadow of the Wing, which I hope you all enjoy. Do you understand what the meaning is? It's the state of a person who feels the need for philosophy, the need for meaning, and the way they express it. That's how Amado Nervo expressed it in a common way. With stories, Zen, expressions, different visions, but deep down, the same yearning, the same anguish, to redeem life from arbitrariness, to give it meaning. Then the shadow of the wing of beloved nerve. You who think I don't see in my thoughts, indeed, truly in yours, can't you imagine my desire? My hunger, my thirst for God. Nor have you heard my desperate cry, which reaches into the depths of darkness, invoking the infinite. If my barren spirit had your fertility, it would have already forged a sky to complete its world. But see what effort fits in a soul without a flag, that goes wherever its tormentor wants, who knows? Who live in a fast of faith and with tenacious heroism. Keeps asking each abyss and, each night, a why. In every way, my thirst for investigation is eager. And the yearning for God, arduous and silent. And there is more love in my doubt than in your tepid affirmation. This poem that I love so much, I hope it stirs in you a thirst for philosophy, so that you understand that what we are trying to offer is a small cup. Philosophy is just that, a small cup. But it quenches exactly the kind of thirst you might be feeling. Come and discover our work. From it, carry out your own work. Understand philosophy. It is part of your life. It is a part of you. Anyway, that's what I had to share with you as a message. It doesn't replace the course. The course is in person. The course generates debates and creates wonderful experiences. The course adds a lot. And you know, you're familiar. I've listed all the websites here. Get to know it. Go and check it out. Attend a lecture. Attend a class. Well, I didn't like it. It's not part of what interests me at the moment. But don't reject the things you don't know. Along the way, we miss many opportunities in life. I generously offer you what was once generously offered to me. I hope it can add value. A hug.